Little Fox.
Thumbelina, Chapter 11. Seeing an Old Friend. The wedding was only a few days away. The dress was made. Mrs. Gray was busy preparing the food. She had even sent out invitations to her friends. Thumbelina had to escape, but it was still very cold outside.
"What am I going to do?"
she said to herself.
Thumbelina, we must leave now.
Mrs. Gray took her hand.
"Where are we going?"
asked Thumbelina. Mrs. Gray's nose wiggled.
Mr. Rufus wants you to see your future home,
she said excitedly.
He's invited us for tea.
Mr. Rufus was waiting by the back door when the mouse opened it.
Oh, Mr. Rufus,
said Mrs. Gray, surprised.
I had to come and get you,
he grunted.
There is a small problem.
What is it?
cried the mouse in alarm.
The tunnel leading to my home is damaged,
Mr. Rufus said.
I will show you.
He turned and walked down the dark tunnel.
Bring the lantern, Thumbelina,
said Mrs. Gray.
And stay close to me.
They followed Mr. Rufus down the dark tunnel. Thumbelina could see only Mrs. Gray's tail ahead of her. Suddenly, Thumbelina saw light up ahead. The tunnel had caved in from above. A beam of sunshine was shining through the hole. A bird lay on the tunnel floor. It was not moving.
What happened?
asked Mrs. Gray.
This nasty bird crashed into our tunnel,
Mr. Rufus said, poking the bird with his cane.
Is the bird dead?
asked Mrs. Gray.
What shall we do?
Thumbelina stepped closer and held the lantern over the bird.
"Oh, it can't be!"
she suddenly cried out.
It's dreadful, I know,
Mr. Rufus said kindly.
but don't worry, I've taken care of everything.
But the mole didn't know what really upset Thumbelina. There was a piece of string tied around the bird's leg. It was her friend Pete.
I've spoken to Slim.
Said Mr. Rufus.
He'll remove the bird in a few days.
Slim, the coyote?
Said Mrs. Gray.
"A coyote?"
Repeated Thumbelina.
Slim will take the body.
Explained Mr. Rufus.
Then I can fix the tunnel.
Thumbelina stared at the dead bird.
"My poor friend,"
she whispered. She began crying.
Are you okay, my dear?
Asked Mrs. Gray.
"No, I'm not!"
cried Thumbelina. She ran back through the dark tunnel toward Mrs. Gray's house. Thumbelina, Chapter 12. A Heart Still Beats. Mrs. Gray was angry with Thumbelina.
You were very rude to run away,
she scolded.
"I was upset,"
said Thumbelina. She could not forget about Pete lying in the tunnel.
Over a silly bird?
Said Mrs. Gray. She refused to talk to Thumbelina all day. That night, she went to bed early and left Thumbelina alone.
Poor Pete.
Thumbelina wept.
I can't leave him lying there as if no one cares.
Thumbelina grabbed one of Mrs. Gray's blankets.
Pete was my friend. He should be covered with something.
She thought. She picked up the lantern and quietly opened the back door. She walked down the tunnel to Pete. Thumbelina's heart hurt when she saw Pete lying there.
I remember you bringing me this string,
she said. Then she untied it from his leg. Thumbelina covered her friend with the blanket and sat next to him. She looked up at the hole in the tunnel.
The stars are beautiful, Pete,
she whispered.
but you won't ever see them again.
Thumbelina started to weep and laid her head on his chest. She heard a faint sound under Pete's feathers. Boom. Thumbelina listened hard. Boom. The sound was getting stronger. Boom. Pete's heart was still beating.
He's alive! Pete!
Thumbelina almost shouted.
Where am I?
Pete said, slowly opening his eyes.
Is that you, Thumbelina?
She could not believe it.
Pete! I'm so glad you're alive!
She cried, hugging him.
I feel warmer.
Pete said,
Let me help you.
said Thumbelina. She quickly ran back to Mrs. Gray's and returned with some water.
What are you doing here, Thumbelina?
Pete asked after drinking the water. Thumbelina sighed loudly.
I'm staying with a very kind mouse, but she wants me to marry Mr. Rufus.
Who's that?
Asked Pete.
He's a mole.
Replied Thumbelina.
He lives underground, and he hates sunshine.
She didn't tell Pete that Mr. Rufus hated birds too,
That's horrible.
said Pete.
We must do something.
First, you need to get better.
Said Thumbelina. The next day, Thumbelina spread her wedding dress on the floor. She filled it with nuts and seeds from Mrs. Gray's cupboard. Then she pulled the edges of the dress together. She dragged it to Pete.
This food will make you well,
said Thumbelina. A few days passed and Pete felt stronger,
I want to hear what happened to you.
said Thumbelina. Pete nodded.
Let me tell you my story.
Thumbelina, Chapter 13. Pete's Story. Pete began his story.
I remember pulling you on that lily pad. Then, suddenly, you were gone. I thought you fell into the water.
A bug named Buzz grabbed me.
Thumbelina explained.
But never mind. Go on with your story.
The lily pad was still hanging from my leg.
Said Pete.
I was looking for you by the stream. The lily pad got caught between some stones, and I tried to pull it free, but the lily pad was stuck. I couldn't move. I had nothing to eat for a few days. Finally, some friends found me. They pecked the lily pad to pieces, but no one could untie the string. By then, it was time for us to fly south.
Then why are you still here?
said Thumbelina.
I couldn't go. I couldn't keep up.
Said Pete.
I was weak, so the string felt heavy. My friends had to leave me. I was able to keep going alone for a while. One day, my wings wouldn't carry me and I fell. When I opened my eyes again, I saw you.
It's my fault.
cried Thumbelina.
No, it's not,
said Pete.
We're friends. And friends help each other, right? So, thank you for helping me, Thumbelina.
You're welcome.
Thumbelina said shyly.
Now that you're better, we need to make a plan.
I'm still a little weak,
Pete said. Thumbelina pointed to the hole above them.
Can you get through there?
Pete looked unsure.
I don't know.
Can you move your wings?
asked Thumbelina.
I'm still so cold,
said Pete.
but I think I can move them a little.
As they discussed their plan, someone was watching them. Mrs. Gray had come down the tunnel looking for Thumbelina.
Thumbelina, what are you doing here?
Screamed the mouse.
Get away from that awful animal.
Don't talk about Pete like that,
said Thumbelina. Then another shape appeared on the other side of the tunnel. It was Mr. Rufus.
What's going on here?
He demanded.
It's alive, Mr. Rufus.
Cried Mrs. Gray.
That bird is not dead.
What?
Mr. Rufus said, shaking his head.
Well, never mind. It won't be alive for long.
What do you mean?
Asked Thumbelina.
Slim's coming.
Said Mr. Rufus, looking up.
I told him to meet me here.
Suddenly, the ground above them began to shake. Dirt fell on their heads. The coyote had arrived, and he was sniffing around.